The town where I grew up was surrounded by dense woodlands, crisscrossed with forgotten trails and abandoned camping spots. I had spent my childhood exploring those woods, but as I got older, life pulled me away. Years later, I returned home for a brief visit and decided to relive my youth with a solo camping trip. I packed light, just a tent, some basic supplies, and enough food for a night or two. My plan was simple. Follow an old trail I vaguely remembered and set up camp near the pond that lay deep in the forest. But after 5 or 6 miles, I realized the path wasn't leading where I expected. Instead, it stretched further into unfamiliar territory, winding endlessly into the thickening trees. Excited by the unexpected detour, I pressed on, eager to see where it led. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, exhaustion crept in. The trail seemed endless, and my legs ached from the hike. I decided to set up camp beside the path. Just as the last sliver of daylight vanished behind the trees. With only minutes before darkness swallowed the forest, I hurried to pitch my tent and gather firewood. Soon a small fire crackled at the center of my camp, casting flickering light against the encroaching night. I boiled some water and made tea, settling into the calming sounds of the nocturnal wilderness. Then I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe, or something foraging in the underbrush. But as the steps grew closer, the unmistakable rhythm of a human gait reached my ears. A figure emerged from the darkness onto the trail, just barely visible at the edge of my firelight. Tall, wearing a large backpack, they walked at a steady pace, not slowing or acknowledging my presence as they passed. Something about them unsettled me. They had no flashlight, no visible gear beyond the pack, and their movement was eerily smooth, almost deliberate. Still, I reasoned they were just another camper on an unknown journey, much like myself. After another hour by the fire, I let it burn down and retreated into my tent. Sleep came easily, but didn't last. A pressure in my bladder woke me deep in the night. Groggy, I fumbled for the zipper and stepped out into the cold air. The forest was silent, the fire long extinguished, leaving only the pale moonlight filtering through the branches. I walked a short distance away, did my business, and turned back. Something moved. Across the clearing, just beyond my tent, a shadow shifted against the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. The moonlight barely illuminated the figure, but I knew it was a person. Slowly, I backed toward my tent, eyes locked on the unmoving silhouette. I reached inside, grabbed my flashlight, and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a man standing on the trail. The same tall figure from earlier, but this time he wasn't walking, he was watching. The second the light touched him, he moved, not toward me, but away, darting behind the trees like a startled animal. My pulse pounded as I strained to see where he had gone, but the night swallowed him whole. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, flashlight shaking in my grip. My mind raced. How long had he been standing there? Had he been watching me since I set up camp? I didn't wait to find out. Moving as quickly as I could, I tore down what little I had set up, stuffing my gear into my pack with trembling hands. The tent wasn't worth the time. I left it behind and hoisted my pack over my shoulders, forcing myself onto the trail. My flashlight flickered as I walked, the batteries struggling. I'd only gone a short distance when I passed the spot where he had been standing. There was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, just empty, undisturbed ground. That was somehow worse. For the next few miles, I barely breathed, scanning the trees, listening for any sound of footsteps behind me. At some point, the first hints of dawn touched the sky, and with it, a false sense of safety. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, I ran to my car and didn't look back. Later, I searched online for information about the trail. To my shock, it wasn't even an official path, just a forgotten route that had been erased from most maps. I found no records of missing hikers, no reports of strange activity. So maybe the man was just another traveler, like me. But if that were true, why was he watching my camp in the dead of night? And why, after all those hours, did I feel certain that he had never really left? I was backpacking along an isolated trail deep in the wilderness of Silver Ridge National Park. It was a rugged out-and-back route, known for its grueling terrain and breathtaking summit views. The entire trek took about 3 days to reach the peak and another 3 to return. I wasn't entirely sure how popular the trail was, but in my experience, long-distance backpacking often meant encountering very few people. On my 3rd day, as I passed one of the designated campsites, I spotted a lone hiker sitting by his tent. He looked relaxed, sipping from a metal flask while watching the treetops sway in the wind. Taking the opportunity for a short break, I approached and we struck up a conversation. His name was Owen, and he planned to camp there for the night before heading to the summit the following day. I mentioned that I was making my final push to the peak that afternoon, and that I might see him when he arrived. After a brief chat, I said my goodbyes and continued my hike. Reaching the summit felt surreal. The view was unlike anything I had ever witnessed, an endless stretch of valleys, lakes, and rugged cliffs bathed in golden light. I set up my camp, eager to spend the next 2 nights enjoying the solitude. As the day passed, not a single person came through. By nightfall, I found myself thinking about Owen. He had said he was heading up the next day, but by dusk, he still hadn't arrived. Perhaps he changed his mind or decided to stay another night at his previous campsite. The following morning, I packed my gear and started my descent. A late start, combined with the ache in my legs, made the journey back more exhausting than I anticipated. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I still hadn't reached my intended stop for the night, Owen's previous campsite. With my headlamp guiding the way, I pushed forward, eventually reaching the site an hour after sunset. His tent was still there. Everything was exactly as I had seen it before, set up as if he had never left. A strange unease settled over me. It was unusual for a backpacker to remain in one spot for multiple days unless something was wrong. I hesitated before calling out, "Owen, you here?" Silence. Stepping closer, I peered at the tent. The flap hung slightly open, revealing an empty interior. His gear was still inside. His sleeping bag, his cooking supplies, everything untouched. A lump formed in my throat. Something wasn't right. I scanned my surroundings, feeling an unsettling awareness creep over me. Then in the distance, I noticed it. A faint glow. A tiny beacon flickering through the trees, maybe 50 yards away. A headlamp. I swallowed hard and took cautious steps toward it, my own light bobbing as I moved. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The headlamp was lying on the forest floor, its weak glow barely pushing through the darkness. Its batteries were nearly dead. Then I saw them. A figure stood in the shadows, just beyond the reach of my light, motionless, watching. They were close, too close. My breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my voice betrayed me. "Hey, do you need help?" No response. I stood frozen, waiting for them to say something, anything, but they just stood there, watching. A cold sweat broke out along my spine. "I'm sorry, I'll go now," I stammered, backing away. I turned and hurried toward the tent, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then behind me, the headlamp's glow vanished. Someone had turned it off. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack, not even bothering to adjust the straps, and started moving, fast. I hiked another 3 miles without stopping, without looking back. When I reached the next designated campsite, I collapsed near the fire pit, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The next morning, as soon as I had service, I reported what I had seen. Owen was missing. The authorities launched a search, but as I suspected, the chances of finding someone in the backcountry were slim. There were no tracks to follow, no signs of struggle. It was as if he had vanished into the wilderness without a trace. And the person I saw in the woods that night, the one watching me, I still don't know who they were, but I have a feeling they hold the answer to what really happened to Owen. And that's what terrifies me the most. Earlier this spring, I went on a solo camping trip deep in the wilderness, about 4 hours from my hometown. Nestled in a hidden valley, there was a small serene lake that I had visited a few times before. It was a place of quiet isolation, rarely visited by anyone else, making it my perfect retreat from the noise of everyday life. When I arrived, the lake was just as I remembered, calm, untouched, and surrounded by thick woods that stretched endlessly in every direction. As I set up camp on the sandy shore, I felt that familiar peace settle over me. For the first few hours, I was completely alone, just the way I liked it. Then, as the sun began to lower in the sky, I spotted movement across the water. A man emerged from the tree line on the opposite shore, carrying a pack and some camping gear. He wasn't unusual looking, just an average guy in his late 20s, probably around my age. He moved with the casual ease of someone familiar with the wilderness, and as he set up his tent, I assumed he was just another camper looking for solitude. As dusk approached, he began making his way around the lake in my direction. I watched him approach, not exactly nervous but curious. When he arrived, he gave me a friendly nod and introduced himself as Daniel. He mentioned that he had seen me from across the lake and figured he'd come over to say hello. Something about his demeanor put me at ease. He was easy to talk to, and we quickly found common ground. Both of us enjoyed off-the-grid camping spots, the kind where you could go days without seeing another soul. We chatted for about half an hour before he returned to his camp as the night took hold. The next day, we ended up spending more time together. He shared some of his supplies, and we talked about everything from past travels to the eerie beauty of the wilderness at night. He seemed like a great guy, and for a brief moment, I entertained the idea of planning future camping trips together. That evening, after parting ways, I sat by my fire, content with how the trip was unfolding. But as the night stretched on, a peculiar feeling began to settle in my gut, something I couldn't quite name. Then, out of the darkness, Daniel reappeared. I hadn't noticed his fire die out, and I had assumed he was asleep in his tent. But here he was, standing at the edge of my campfire's glow, his posture strangely stiff. "Hey," I greeted him. "Everything all right?" His lips curled into an odd smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. I just thought you'd want to check out this amazing view I found. Best spot in the whole area, especially at night." I hesitated. Something about the way he spoke felt off, forced, maybe. But he insisted, talking it up like it was a hidden gem, something I absolutely couldn't miss. Against my better judgment, I agreed. After all, wasn't that part of the adventure, exploring the unknown? I followed him around the lake and into the dense forest, my flashlight casting long, shifting shadows between the trees. As we walked, I noticed how effortlessly he navigated the darkness. No hesitation, no second guessing. He had been here before, many times. 15 minutes in, he slowed his pace, then stopped altogether. He gestured ahead with a silent nod, and I stepped forward, expecting some breathtaking overlook. Instead, my light landed on something else, an old abandoned camper, half swallowed by nature. Its metal shell was rusted and covered in creeping moss, windows shattered, the door slightly ajar. A chill ran through me. I turned back to Daniel, but his face was different now, void of that friendly warmth from earlier. "What is this?" I asked, my voice unsteady. He didn't answer. Then before I could react, the camper door swung open with a metallic screech, and something came rushing out. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. My body reacted before my mind could process, my legs propelling me into the darkness. I heard footsteps pounding behind me, more than one pair. They were chasing me. The forest was a blur of tangled branches and shifting shadows. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, adrenaline overriding my exhaustion. Somehow, by sheer luck or instinct, I managed to lose them. I didn't stop until the sky lightened with the first hints of dawn. When I finally found my way back to the lake, I stayed hidden in the trees, heart pounding. My campsite was gone. Every trace of my presence had been erased. Tent, supplies, even the ashes of my fire. It was as if I had never been there. I didn't go back for my car immediately. I made sure no one was watching before slipping onto the trail and making my way out. I reported it to the authorities. They took notes, asked a few questions, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. I never heard back from them. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I had stepped inside that camper, and I don't want to know.